All right, hello everyone, and welcome to APA Division 47's first quarterly webinar, Fostering Inclusive Conversations in Professional Spaces. My name is Dr. Chelsea Battle, and I am the co-chair of Division 47's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee, and I'm very excited to be here with you all today as your moderator. Before we get started, I just want to go over a couple of quick things to help the session run smoothly today. First, if you have any questions for our speakers throughout the presentation, please use the Q&A box, not the chat. You should see the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. We'll save about 15 minutes at the end of the entire webinar for a Q&A session. I'll be keeping an eye on your questions as they come in, and I'll share them with the speakers at the end. Feel free to submit your questions at any point during the presentation. Also, this session is not eligible for CE credit. You will get an email within the next week with a short evaluation form, and we would love to hear what your thoughts are about this presentation and get your suggestions for future webinar topics. Lastly, today's session is being recorded and will be posted on the division's website and our YouTube channel within the next week. With that, I am very excited to introduce today's speakers, Dr. Anna Baith and Dr. Tamara Harris, and we will begin things with Dr. Baith.
Great. Chelsea, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you are on the West Coast. I'm Dr. Anna Baith. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Vice President of Programs and Research for Athlete Ally. To start, I want to thank Dr. Battle and Dr. Pruitt-White for holding space for this conversation, and a conversation that's becoming increasingly difficult to have, not because of lack of interest, I've found, but because of intensifying political resistance. I am very excited to be here. And admittedly, I feel a little bit out of place because I am not a sports psychologist. So today, I come to you instead from my place at the intersections of research, education, and LGBTQI inclusion. Today, I want to share some recent research I've done on message testing around trans athlete participation. And while this session, of course, isn't about trans athletes per se, I'd like to use the conversations I've had and studied about trans athlete inclusion as a proxy for demonstrating how we might initiate and facilitate DEI conversations in sports psychology and adjacent spaces. Most of all, I want to utilize the data I've found to demonstrate how the general public, including athletes and folks working in athletics, are approaching not just the topic of trans athletes, but I believe topics around diversity, equity, and inclusion broadly. So to level set, I don't think we can talk about inclusion in any part of sport or sports psychology without acknowledging the reality that we are living and operating within a particularly harsh political moment for DEI. In my work with NCAA athletic departments over the last several years, it seems some athletes and teams are but unaware of what's happening with DEI, while others are directly impacted and in turn are impacted by anti-DEI policies and are hyper aware of what's happening. I work for a nonprofit, and I will say too that nonprofit organizations, and I think higher ed institutions broadly, are running blindly away from DEI because of political constraints. And in turn, leaders are cutting language, resources, and expectations around DEI altogether. For my part, I'd like to discuss this anti-DEI landscape from a framing of anti-transness. And this is mostly because in 2019, I entered the world of trans athlete activism because I was hired at Athlete Ally, a nonprofit focused on LGBTQI inclusion in sport. Prior to that, I was completing my PhD, and I was actually a collegiate coach for several years. I still coach on the side, but I really came from athletics, and I don't think I was hyper aware or really aware of what was happening with LGBTQ inclusion in sport until I was hired at Athlete Ally. And when I was hired, um, it was 2019. And little did I, or I suspect anyone, know then what trans athlete allyship would mean as of 2025. In 5, 6 years, trans athletes have been more visible and vilified than ever before in history. And that visibility is spilling over into our opinions and approaches to sport. So, as a case in point, polls in 2021 found that just 28% of Americans supported bills to ban trans athlete participation. A mere 2 years later, a similar poll found that number had jumped to 69%. Fear of trans athletes and its effects by way of policy changes has been one of the swiftest social movements in the history of the United States, and certainly within sport. Collectively, since 2020, policy and public opinion about trans athletes and DEI broadly has been shaped more by political rhetoric than by informed perspective and evidence. Over the last 5 years, I've attempted as a scholar to interpret these trends and as an educator and activist to understand how we can combat them. I want to combine those two practices today to talk about data on anti intellectualism and how we can use that to talk to others that we interact with, whether in our jobs as sports psychologists or in our jobs in athletics, or frankly, over the dinner table. So, to start, I want to turn to the common narrative that anti trans bills are being passed because the endogenous or naturally occurring testosterone in trans women's bodies affords them a competitive advantage. And I bring this up because this is the question that I get pretty much every day. Um, is it fair for there to be trans athletes in sport? And I think this is not unlike other questions we might be asked as professionals with expertise in certain areas. Like, what do we think about DEI in sport? Does it matter? So I want to address that question in particular. And instead of actually talking about the question, I want to talk about how I talk about the question. So, for a few years, when people mentioned this narrative to me, or they would ask me, you study trans athletes, is it fair for there to be trans women in sport? I would sit down and talk them through the limitations of testosterone and sex testing. I talk about what the science says, what it doesn't say, in hopes of really having a discussion on the matter. And what I found is pretty much every time I did that, I noticed the reactions were most often apathy, cognitive dissonance, sometimes rage and anger, and frankly, sometimes just blatant sexism, sometimes toward me. So I was managing this for a few years early in my career at Athlete Ally, and then I decided to get really curious about those reactions. So because I'm a nerd, I decided to do a study on it, and I decided to ask average Americans about it. So in 2023, my research team surveyed 1,500 voters across the United States, diverse in their gender identities, racial and ethnic identities, political leanings, age, and education. We asked voters what they had heard about trans athletes in the last year, where they had heard it, and what their opinions on the topic were. We then provided them educational materials based on peer-reviewed science and facts, not unlike what I would generally share with people when they ask about trans athletes and fairness in an everyday conversation. After we gave them this information, we then asked people if their opinions had shifted at all based on the data, if they felt more educated, and if they felt compelled to act on behalf of or against trans athletes based on the data. The results were both unsurprising and startling. And Chelsea, can we pop to the next slide, please? Mm. Thank you. So what we found is that 51% of voters were apathetic or indifferent. They said trans athletes were largely irrelevant to their lives. And I might argue that I find that this is the case with other DEI issues and interests. I think there is a large swath of the population that is generally indifferent. And I want to just name that. 21% of voters felt more inclined to support trans athlete inclusion after learning more, and 28% continued to or felt more opposed to trans athlete participation. Those who were inclined toward inclusion were people under the age of 35. They were more likely to identify as women. And what they said is that they felt more educated and more compelled to act after learning more about the data. They were curious, they wanted more information, they wanted more data, and they wanted to feel equipped to have conversations around this topic, but also just around DEI topics in general. Older respondents, Republicans, and self-identified major sports fans, especially those consuming media like Fox Sports, were far less likely to support trans inclusion. I think this is maybe unsurprising. What I did expect from the results was that these shifts, so either toward or away from trans inclusion, were partially rooted in personal exposure. So, younger and more politically liberal people were more likely to know a trans person and more likely to get information from platforms like TikTok or Instagram as opposed to generalized and mass media. What I didn't expect was that while some people were mobilized to support trans athlete participation, others felt compelled to discourage it. And there was a small but mighty sliver of voters who wanted to take direct action against trans athletes after hearing the data. Now, I bring all of this up because I think these reactions are illustrative of a few social trends happening within the United States and frankly, globally right now. First, there is an increasing amount of social isolation and isolationism based on where people are getting their information, who they interact with, and what media platforms they use. People are more siloed than ever, and it's showing up in conversations about politics, DEI, and now more than ever, sport. Second, there is a collective erosion of trust in data and knowledge systems or anti-intellectualism. Anti-intellectualism is a social attitude of undermining facts, academic and institutional authorities, and the pursuit of knowledge. As political scientists and historians have found, anti-intellectual people, when provided information or data, dig their heels further into their opposing position. While anti-intellectualism generally fit the bill of our survey and this survey in particular, I think we are seeing something slightly different here. An attitude that not only mistrusts, but gleefully encourages outspoken, vehement dislike and sometimes violent action against athletes, scholars, and sport practitioners who have expertise. Um, and often when people, part of what happens with anti-intellectualism is when people learn data, read science, whatever it might be, not only do they not trust it, but most often it brings up this feeling of aggrievement that leaves people wanting to do something about it. And I think we've seen this in a lot of different cases in sport, but a couple of examples that come to mind right away. You know, of course, there's anti-trans policies, but I also think broadly we're seeing this relative to most athletes with marginalized identities. And I'm thinking here about a lot of the social media backlash against women, particularly women of color in athletics, the trolling on their social medias, the vehement, outspoken hatred of athletes and activists. We're seeing it relative to a mistrust of international athletes, particularly around, sensibilities with Gaza. Um, so I think collectively, what we're seeing again is just this real push against DEI, but also against people who uh, we think uphold DEI. So, what do we do about it? How do we better communicate with one another in this moment when people are getting caught up, not just in an anti DEI moment, but I think in being actively afraid of one another? How do we talk to people who don't occupy the same media or social spaces we do? And how do we converse with people who want to push back on DEI, on data? Um, these are the questions that I've been thinking about incessantly for the last year or so. And I want to share a couple of the strategies I think we can employ, or that I at least have been testing out. Uh, one, we must expand our pedagogical toolkit to combat anti intellectualism. I think for many years, I thought if I can just provide people with information, they may be more inclined to be inclusive, to develop stronger interpersonal relationships with people who are different than them. Um, that simply, at least according to some data, is not true. Anti-intellectualism is growing. It's not just among the public, it's shaping university policies, funding decisions, internal dynamics within athletic departments and sporting organizations. So, political scientist Matthew Mata, and I would highly encourage anybody to look up some of his work if you're curious about this. He identifies two key variables that reduce anti intellectualism: verbal intelligence and curiosity. Verbal intelligence is cultivated over time through engagement with complex concepts, sustained discussion, and nuanced language. So, we have tried to think through verbal intelligence with a pretty wide lens at Athlete Ally. And a couple of the ways that we are trying to combat anti-intellectualism are through different resources. So one is Champions of Inclusion. It is a free online training tool that Athlete Ally put out last year. We rebooted it last year. And it provides a series of modules that work through language around LGBTQ inclusion, but really focuses on intersectional allyship as well. And the idea behind Champions of Inclusion is that it's really a launching pad. So we want it to be used as a tool to teach language, to teach concepts, and to teach some of the context around that language and those concepts, but also as really a way to begin conversations. So we also have Athlete Ally chapters. These are collective groups of athletes who some identify as LGBTQ, some don't, some are just allies on different college campuses. And again, the idea here is if we can cultivate those communities, we can sustain those conversations over time. And ideally, as those conversations are sustained, people will begin to just have a more nuanced understanding of these issues. Two, uh, we need to understand the emotional landscape here. Opposition to DEI is often emotional, not intellectual. It stems from fear, identity threat, and generally a perceived loss of control. I believe our work must acknowledge this effective terrain. So one of the new systems that we have, it's an educational platform. It will be coming out hopefully at the end of this month. It's called 30 Practices of Allyship. It is an educational resource through Substack that focuses on being curious and leading with care-filled behaviors. So the idea behind this is that we are focusing on 30 days, 30 practices of just doing everyday allyship behaviors. And the idea here is to focus more on interpersonal relationships, developing interpersonal relationships, thinking through how we show and receive care as a starting point to having more in-depth conversations about issues like trans inclusion, but also about all sorts of issues related to DEI. And I will note that if it's not obvious, I'm a sociologist, not a psychologist. So I really am grateful to be here because as we're thinking through these modules and our education systems at Athlete Ally, we are open to feedback. I would love to hear from folks, maybe who are on this webinar, who are interested in this, who are knowledgeable about this, perhaps who are knowledgeable about the emotional landscape. I think there's a lot of space there to think about how we do this and how we do it collectively. And the third main way I'm trying to do this is to move beyond the idea of crafting the right messages and beyond centering data. As our research shows, messaging and communicating is only as effective as an audience's capacity to receive it. So it's not about the message, it's about the person on the other side. And I think about this a lot in terms of, how we're talking with people who are making decisions, particularly leaders in our institutions around DEI. But I also think this really gets at the heart of it, this really comes down to rehumanization. I think what we're seeing in social media and a lot of different media platforms and even everyday conversations is a dehumanization of folks who maybe don't look like us or who have different identities than we do. And so this is when I really focus on centering resources like Changing the Game, which is a documentary that looks at the lives of several trans youth athletes, hearing their stories, understanding that people are people. I also point to certain folks on social media, particularly Chris Mosier, if you don't follow him. I think Aaron Reed and Frankie De La Cretez do great work on this too, really just highlighting what's happening around DEI in sport, particularly as it pertains to trans and non-binary athletes, but also, again, really focusing on the human side of this. To this end, I also think conversing or teaching about DEI in sport necessitates not just facts, but a willingness to sit with, unpack, and imaginatively investigate common sense language, a lot of the common sense narratives we're hearing, and frankly, our own skin in the game of those stories. Now, when Dr. Battle reached out, she asked for us to talk a little bit about how we incorporate DEI into our own work. I think I'm a little bit in a little bit of a different boat because I do a lot of DEI work just by proxy of being in an advocacy organization. But I also think when it comes to sport and athletics, as a coach and as an athletics colleague, some of the strategies that I try to employ most often are talking about my own journey. 10 years ago, I was not an advocate for trans inclusion in sport. And I did a lot of work over those 10 years to learn more, to listen more. And as a result, my thinking patterns changed. And I think there is a real capacity amongst others to change or to think about issues in novel ways. Um, or at least that's my hope. Um, I think too that because of the ways that we are being siloed, it is often assumed that we are either in one camp or another camp. And I think it's important to really have conversations about where we sit in the middle of those, and how we can move between them. Some other ways that I really try to focus on DEI is via coalition building and recognizing that intersectional allyship is it's vital and it's absolutely necessary in this moment. So really thinking about how certain systems are impacting not just say LGBTQ athletes, but also athletes of color, women athletes, um, international athletes, the list goes on and on. But really thinking about how we are all in the same camp to some extent. Finally, I think it's really important to focus on what's actually movable and who's actually movable. And I'm going to be talking about this. I'll just plug, we have our Athlete Activism Summit next week. This is a major event where we bring together scholars and athletes and administrators to talk about a lot of these issues. And one of our focal points this year is to really focus on who we can have robust conversations and nuanced conversations with, and how we continue to develop those. As I've said, I think we have a difficult path ahead if we're to take seriously anti-intellectualism, isolationism, and to offer nuanced, in-depth understandings of the issues at hand. But I think we can facilitate conversations with care and curiosity. And I'm hoping to come into this session today with a sense of care and curiosity myself. And I hope you all might join me today and in our Q&A and afterward in continuing to figure out how we can make these strategies a real possibility together. Thank you. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Harris.
Thank you, Dr. Bates. Appreciate it. Thank you. Great presentation. I want to lead with something Dr. Bates shared, so much valuable information. But I love what she also, as she closed out and mentioning or just saying, people are people. So based on that, I want to go into cultural diversity and cultural understanding and what all of that looks like in this journey, right? And so let me get my screen here. There we go, right there. All right, so embracing diversity and inclusion in sport, and here we go. So building on a lot of what Dr. Bates has shared with us, it's important to understand that athletes face very unique challenges. And so unique challenges based on ethnicity, race, based on racism, discrimination. There's so many different challenges that athletes face, in addition to striving to perform at their best, right? And so cultural understanding and acceptance plays a crucial role in shaping these experiences. And so in the field of sports psychology and in the field of counseling, I have both backgrounds. Our ethical frameworks are based on creating spaces that are open and flexible and diversity and understanding the clients that we work with, right? And so that is so key. So when we're talking about that, kind of look at our roles as SPPs, sport psychology professionals in the field, or mental health professionals in the field, we wear so many hats. And so thinking about the climate that we are all living in now, that piece on advocacy, that's a hat that we wear. We're educators as well in our work with athletes. And also we are social change agents. So we're responsible for creating that safe and inclusive environment for all athletes. And that's part of our ethical obligation and responsibility, right? And so thinking along those lines, we're in a unique space to share our voice, to make change. We're in a unique space to collaborate with coaches, team leaders, mental health professionals, and other community members in regards to creating a support system for athletes that we work with various different backgrounds. And then overall, our responsibility, ethical responsibility, is over the welfare and well-being of our clients and athletes that we work with beyond performance in the work that we do. So when we're talking about multicultural competence, and I always share this with individuals that I'm working with students and trainings and workshops and all of that, one multicultural course doesn't make you multiculturally competent. What I mean by that, it's an ongoing, lifelong process, right, of learning from people who are different from us, of being accepting and flexible and adaptable. And I love the word Dr. Babe used, is that curiosity, right, wanting to learn more from people who are different from us. So cultural competence is a lifelong process in which a person develops an understanding and acceptance of the worldview of others who are different from them, or different than their own. So being able to look out of the lens of other people who are different from you, right? And so I'm gonna take a pause here because I forgot to tell you this. So think along the lines of, when was a time that you felt like you were treated as of other, right? Or otherness, right? Based on race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, ability, or socioeconomic status. So as we go along, continue with the presentation, kind of think about how you were treated, and all of us have been, but think of a time when you were treated as other. And what was that experience like for you? What is diversity, equity, and inclusion in sports? When we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, as Dr. Babe shared, the education piece is going to be key. So diversity, representation of various identities, including race, gender, sexual orientation, abilities, socioeconomic status, many of what I've just shared with you, to kind of think about a time you were treated as other. And also fair access to resources and opportunities in sport, equal access, right? And then of course, inclusion, environments that value and respect all participants, all athletes. I love this slide. I think this is probably my favorite slide. What's in your cultural baggage? It's important that we all have assumptions, biases, stereotypes, things that we carry from our upbringing, from our culture, how we view the world, right? But it's important to be aware of those biases, assumptions, and stereotypes when we are interacting with people who are different from us. And so not only being aware of those, our cultural baggage, as Dr. Babe said, having difficult conversations around it. That is how we learn, that is how we grow, that is how we develop. So what's in your cultural baggage? It's typically unconscious influence, right? We really don't know that it's there. We don't know what we don't know, right? We're unaware that we're carrying the baggage, and that baggage tends to shape how we view people, how we view their behaviors, how we judge. It also affects our communication styles and social norms. So how does this affect our work as SPPs in the field? we have to be aware of our own cultural baggage in order to build trust and rapport in the work with our clients. And that goes back to that self-awareness. That is the foundation of everything, right? To be aware, yes, there's an issue here with me. I didn't understand this, or I do have a bias against whatever that is. But definitely being able to look in the mirror is going to be key. Also, we carry this implicit bias. And so that's another thing to just be aware of, right? It refers to unconscious attitudes or stereotypes that influence our understanding, actions, and decisions, often without our awareness, right? So again, going back to knowledge and education, but also having these conversations, difficult conversations around these types of topics. That opens the lens to be able to, that opens the way to be able to look out of a different lens and actually being able to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. So when we're talking about microaggressions, right? It's that subtle, often unintentional comments or behaviors that convey derogatory or negative messages to people based on their marginalized identity, right? And many times, again, we are not aware of this, but definitely being able to work through these issues. So again, thinking about a time that you were treated different or a comment that was made towards you was derogatory. So kind of think about that along these lines as well. So why is diversity, equity, inclusion matter as far as athlete mental health? It builds a psychology safety. So what I mean by that is being able to create these spaces, to be able to talk about cultural differences, to be able to talk about these tough topics, right? It allows athletes to be in a space where they feel as they belong, right? Like they belong. They feel this sense of safety, right? It reduces bias and discrimination by having these types of conversations, and then building that psychological safety around in the work with athletes. It enhances an athlete's, again, sense of belonging and encourages them to reach out for mental health services, that help seeking behaviors, to be able to reach out and say, hey, I need help, to feel like they belong, to feel accepted, but to feel like it's okay when we create that environment and working with athletes, but also it helps them to even reach out, be able to reach out even more when faced with a mental health challenge. So that ethical and cultural considerations in the work that we do with athletes, respecting the culture, norms, and traditions, values, and beliefs of people that are different from us, providing that cultural responsive care. And that goes back to that self-awareness, and that is work, right? That is work to be able to look in the mirror and know that, hey, these are issues that I need to work on in order to be able to accept cultural differences or accept the beliefs and values of someone that's totally different from me. And so being aware of our own thoughts, our own biases, our own stereotypes and assumptions, because again, we all carry cultural baggage, is going to be key in building on cultural competence. So what does diversity, equity, and inclusion, how does that promote a space, a safe space, a psychological safe space in the sport culture? It's that team thrives when athletes feel safe and to express their concerns, right? The psychological safety increases, again, athletes' willingness to reach out for help when they need to. And it creates environments centered on respect, support, and a sense of belonging. So I go back to a few things that I was thinking about as I was, creating this presentation. We're talking about equity, diversity, and we were talking about inclusion. It's key because this builds on social cohesion and strong communities. And so in the field of sport, it is so important to create this space in our work with athletes. and as they create the space in teams and working together. So building on that trust, building on motivation, building resilience in athletes, inclusion strengthens that, right? And strengthens the resilience and motivation and work with athletes. It boosts encouragement, well, engagement and team cohesion. And then, of course, supports athletes to perform at higher levels. Teams thrive when athletes feel safe. They feel safe to express their thoughts, their feelings, their emotions. Teams thrive when the environment is a respectful environment, regardless of cultural differences, beliefs, and values. And it's important to engage in cultural humility, just knowing that you're not going to know everything about a person's cultural background, their values, beliefs, but I always like to tell people that your clients are going to be your best teachers. So I love this thing that we do in counseling work. We have something called cultural call out. So in the very beginning, before that relationship even builds, before we even get started, right? We talk about what our differences are and being aware of those right up front, right? And what you're aware of in the beginning, but just creating that space to have a conversation about it. So what that does is the practitioner will say something like, I understand there are cultural differences between us. And I will say what, my cultural background is. I will ask the client if they feel comfortable of sharing what their cultural background is, perhaps their pronouns, creating that space at the very beginning. So this is why this is so important. When we create that space in the work with athletes, right, or the work with clients, when I make a mistake, because likely I will, again, we all carry cultural baggage, it creates a space where the person can say, stop, wait, you were wrong about that. That's not the way that is. That's not my belief. That's not how I feel. That's not my upbringing, right? So be able to create that space, and then me saying, I apologize for that. I'm here to learn from you. Can you tell me more, right? And that allows me to understand the client much better than having my own assumptions and biases that I'm not aware of, that comes out in that communication, that communication. So creating a space, a safe space in your work with clients, it's going to be key. So that cultural call out in the very beginning, being open to learning, being flexible, being adaptable in this journey of cultural competence is key. Educate yourself on implicit bias and microaggressions and being able to talk through those, right? And then collaborate with diverse mental health professionals or professionals in the field to be able to have these types of conversations. So again, the diversity inclusion piece, it builds trust and communication in the work with athletes. It develops resilience and motivation in the work with athletes. And again, a part of this also opens space where building that trust and rapport, athletes are more likely to reach out when faced with a mental health challenge, where the stigma is reduced and the communication is open, and being able to share and talk about and get support. And then the piece about higher retention in sports. When athletes feel that they belong, a sense of belonging, a sense of respect, a sense of value, and their voices are heard, the retention is higher in sports, that they'll stay in, right? And enjoy what they do. And this is key. All right, that concludes my presentation. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Babe, and thank you, Dr. Harris. I really appreciated both of you all's presentations. With that, at this time, we will use the next 15 minutes to go through some of the questions that we have. I have some questions that I've been making note of as I was listening to you two. If you all could use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions that you have, I will pose those questions to our speakers. For the first question, and Dr. Baith, you mentioned this earlier in your presentation, that opposition to DEI is often emotional. And I'm posing this question to both of you, but what suggestions do either of you have for bridging the gap between potential emotional reactions you might get in conversations, but still trying to have an informed conversation? How can we bridge that gap?
I'll let you start, Dr. Bay.
Thank you. Yeah, one second here. I'm just gonna jot down a few notes. Yeah, okay, so whew, emotions. Well, I think first, I always try to keep in mind that emotions are energy. And if somebody is having an emotional reaction, it is likely because they have a vested interest. And I actually think that is a great starting point. Now, maybe that emotional energy is an emotion that feels a little harder for me personally to process in a conversation, like anger, or, often it's a dismissal. But again, I have found that if there is a reaction, there is a reason. And if I can get to that reason and understand the reaction, then we can have a real conversation. Um, I also think it's important to say that, of course, like I have emotional reactions too. And so I always try to foreground conversations with that too, to say, listen, most of us don't do this for the money. We do it because we care. And I care deeply about my athletes, and I care deeply about, their well-being. And so starting with, I think emotion and how that leads to care is a first starting point. I would also say, and this is maybe more of a, I don't know, outside comment, but sometimes people have outsized responses to the situation. And I also think that that's a moment to pause and say, this feels like a really big reaction. Can we unpack that a little bit? What precisely do you think is maybe happening here? And I found that that's really helpful, particularly when working with teams and working through interpersonal dynamics. I don't know if that's helpful. I also think the last part of it for me is like, you just got to practice. I talk to a lot of people who have very different opinions and viewpoints than me. And for a long time, that really scared me. And then I was like, you know what? If I can't talk to people, why am I doing this? So I just started having the conversations. And I think when you continue to have those conversations and get to helpful alignment points, you'll keep having them.
So I agree, Dr. Baith, and I really think, when having those type of emotions, or, with some of these difficult topics, and then just in the space that we're in, but having those type of emotions in a conversation, I'll say lean into it, right? I agree with Dr. Baith. There's a reason why that you're having the emotion or feeling that you're having. I think it's important to recognize what that emotion is, name it, right? Lean into it and talk about it. When I facilitate workshops and trainings on multicultural competence, and when there's some topics that come up are very difficult for people, I say, good. Yeah, now let's talk about it. I'm concerned when it's not a issue, right? I'm very concerned because that means you're not being honest. It means like we're not normalizing this conversation. It means that you're hiding something. It means that that cultural suitcase, that your baggage and that suitcase that you're carrying, you're not willing to take those things out, right? And unpack that. So again, I'm concerned when people don't have emotions around these tough topics, right? And so again, leaning into it, how do you feel? What is the feeling? And then talk through why are you feeling the way you're feeling? And a lot of times it's just our lived experiences, the knowledge that we don't have, right? And then here's a big thing that I've realized, and it takes work, really being able to face your own biases, your own assumptions, your own prejudices. I've had people, I'm not prejudiced. I think I love everyone. I treat everyone the same. No, you don't. You do not. Right. And so we talk about that. And I get some pushback sometimes that, hey, that's good too. But still being in a respectful manner that you can see this, that you can talk about it, and then that you can be honest and learn from it. I think that's key.
Thank you both. I think what I'm taking from what you both said is that it takes work. And I think sometimes we hope that it will be a simple conversation, and it's
Yeah.
ongoing conversations, and it's more than one conversation.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
My next question is, how are self-awareness and authenticity connected to the ways that we carry our cultural baggage?
It's a good one. Yeah. Repeat that one more time because that's a good question.
How are our self-awareness and authenticity connected to the ways that we carry our cultural baggage?
Yeah. I would say, I'm just kind of thinking about the question, and I think self-awareness is the foundation, again, of cultural competence, and that's a ongoing process of learning and knowledge, right? But the less that suitcase, that's what's in that suitcase, when you start unpacking things, the better, right? Because that means that, yes, I'm carrying this load. I'm aware that I'm carrying this load, but also I'm willing to unpack and work through these issues. And I think that's key. So the other thing is that's like that otherness, right? Can you put yourself in someone else's shoes? Are you able to look out of the lens or worldview of someone else and still, although it may be different from yours, and still being able to learn, number one, accept their differences, beliefs, values, or whatever that may be, and still have that social connection, interaction, and build on that. And I think that is something to think about.
Dr. Bates, if you want to add anything to that.
I think I would just say too that we all have cultural baggage. And sometimes it's really helpful to say, like, I'm going to unpack mine over here. Can you unpack yours over there? And when you're doing that together, it's hard. It can be hard. It can be ugly. It can be weird. But it's also beautiful. And to say, like, wow, this unpacking and everything that's coming up as I'm doing that, to have somebody in that with you, it can be incredibly powerful. And I think it often leads to a recognition of how maybe our cultural baggages look different, but often are the same.
Great points.
Thank you. I'm reading one of the questions that we have in the Q&A box. When the emotional response is based on an oppressive attitude, and you are a professional who does not have protected identities, how do you navigate these conversations when an identity you hold is being discriminated against due to oppression?
I would say supervision, consultation is going to be key, right? Because you're going to be faced with that, right? So understanding your ethical obligation, right? Being able to look in the mirror and continue to learn, but also being able to talk about these things with other peers, other professionals in the space, but also sometimes just reaching out to a supervisor to talk to things as well. So really what I'm saying is consulting with others, right? And I think that are even more experienced in this area, have gone through these experiences, I think that would be key.
I agree. And I think everybody is going to handle those situations differently. So it's a matter of first figuring out how you want to handle it.
Mhm.
But I also appreciate this question because I think to not only speak to supervisors but to colleagues can be really helpful. And I think this question actually provides an opportunity to talk about how we are asking others to show up for us and how we're showing up for others too. Because I'll speak for myself, I found that when this happens, I have a really hard time navigating how I want to handle it. Um, but when I see it happen to somebody else, I know exactly how I want to handle it. And so I think it's a great question to be asking others in your space and in your network to figure out like how can we also show up for each other? And I think within the folks on this call and this webinar, it's a good question too.
I also want to share, there may be something that I'll say for myself, have gone through and thought I went through this or worked through it. It may be an issue where I felt like I was discriminated against or whatever that is. And I thought I worked through that, but then I see that same thing in my client, right? And now I'm angry and upset and I am no good for my client at this point, right? That means that goes back to that self-awareness, right? Because if I'm seeing the same experience that I'm seeing in my client, it's a counter-transference thing. And it's like, hey, I got to be aware of that, number one, because that's going to be key to be able to work through this. But the second thing, I have to step back and get help on my own. So that may be a mental health counselor professional to be able to work through an experience that I thought I worked through, right? In order for me to be effective in my work with a client. So it may be that I need to step back a minute and take care of my own issue and related to this, and then come back around. So just being able to recognize that.
I think it's so important to know when we're not in a space to serve others. And I think being an advocate and an ally, you always want to serve. It's our natural calling, if you will. It's second nature. So it's hard to have that self-awareness that way. This is time for me to put this down at this moment. I think about also how I work in a collegiate athletic system and I get pushback for some of the things that I suggest, or sometimes for simply being a Black woman. And I'm always thinking about how can I make the smallest amount of meaningful change? Because some days I naturally just want to do the most. I want to make all the change in the world. I want to do all the things. And that's sometimes too heavy, right? What would you suggest is the way that we can make the smallest amount of meaningful change? Or what is something you've done to make the smallest amount of meaningful change?
Maybe I can start here just from my work. I had a pretty serious reckoning last year that was just like, no matter what happens over the next few years relative to social justice and sport, this is my calling and I will be on the other side of it. Part of what I think is happening is this erasure of DEI in sport and erasure of the people who are doing the work. And I guess my sense of that I came to was, okay, well, if you want to erase me, fine. But I'm still going to be here in 5 years. I'm still going to be here in 10 years doing the same work, or doing the work to the best of my ability. And to have that long view has been really helpful for my own health and well-being, because I can just say at the end of the day, okay, maybe I can't do everything today, but part of what I need to do is take care of me and the people who I love and the people who are doing this work so that we can all be on the other side.
I like that, Dr. Bade. And that goes back to self-care, taking care of our own wellness and making that a priority. So we are in some challenging times in the field of sport, right? But that goes back to those hats that we wear, and we still wear those hats, right? The foundation of what sport, what counseling and professions, helping professions stand on, just the welfare of our clients. And then of course, the hats that we wear for advocacy and social change. Those are the hats that we're wearing. These are the fields that we're in, and our overall well-being is our overall focus, right? Responsibility is the welfare of our clients that we serve.
Thank you.
But we got to be well enough to do that. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question, and this one was for you specifically, Dr. Bade. Does Athlete Ally provide groups for allies? If so, where can we connect and support one another, especially in this moment in time? It feels like we have to be very intentional in gathering with one another, learning from one another, and showing up for one another as we take risks in our climate so that we don't isolate and feel alone.
Yeah, we do. So as I mentioned, we have our summit next week. That's a big in-person event where we can be together. I would say email me and I'll point you in the right direction, or you can just email info@athleteally.org. But I love and appreciate the question because I think the more we can be in this together, the better off we'll all be.
Well, thank you to both of our speakers. Before we go, I also want to thank our attendees. Please be on the lookout for more webinars from Division 47 in the future. This was our first quarterly webinar, but we hope to have several more in the future. Just as a reminder, you'll get an email with the link to the feedback form within the next week. We'd really appreciate you taking a few minutes to fill out that form and let us know what you thought and what you would like to see next time. Thank you again, and we appreciate you.